Welcome. It has just gone 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Wednesday, the 22nd of February, and you are watching episode 76 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing an insight on the issues affecting regional Australia and giving a voice to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode is there a solution to juvenile crime? Is my guest, Professor Ross Homel of Griffith University, Criminology and Criminal Justice Institute. Ross is a foundation professor of the Criminology and Criminal Justice Institute at Griffith University. He has published 3 monographs and 6 edited books, as well as more than 150 peer-reviewed papers and numerous high-impact government reports. He is a leader within his discipline and is passionate and a strong advocate around the world for policies and practices that are based on firm scientific evidence. Ross has an established national and international reputation, winning many awards for his research on prevention of crime, violence and injuries, and the promotion of positive development and well-being for children and young people in socially disadvantaged communities. Ross's career focus is the theoretical analyst of crime and associated problems such as violence, child abuse, injuries, substance abuse, and corruption, together with the prevention of these problems through the scientific method to problem analysis and the development and implementation of evaluation of interventions. Welcome, Ross.
Well, thank you, Bill, for that introduction. I really must make that shorter and simpler.
I did cut down a little bit here and there just to get it all in, but no, welcome to the show. Look, we greatly appreciate your time. Especially in the current environment, what's happened, especially in the last couple of days with the big headlines and that. But before we get to that, if you could just start off with your introduction in regards to your childhood and how you entered the field you're in, and the gradual different jobs you did, especially up to getting into the area where you're actually providing advice and policy input to the government.
Well, thanks, Bill. And I must say it's not often that I get asked to talk about my life history, so cut me short if I ramble too long. But we were chatting earlier. I mentioned that my father was born in Bowen in North Queensland, and his father was a labourer. His father had emigrated from France. It was from a family of sailors at Cherbourg, and but he came out in the latter period of the gold rush to Ballarat to sell goods to the miners. My father was born just in time to join the army. Actually, he joined the Air Force initially in 1939 and was invalided out, but because he had a duodenal ulcer, but didn't tell anyone, and he joined the army. They didn't bother to check. Spent the next 6 years in the 9th Division, and that was a formative experience for him. He never talked a lot about the war, but I knew that it had shaped his attitudes. And his father before him had been a digger in the First World War, and was wounded at Villers-Bretonneux in 1918, as so many other Australians were. So I guess I've got a long history on all sides of my family going back to the 19th century. When I was born in Sydney because Dad didn't want to move back to North Queensland after the war. He saw more opportunity in Sydney. So I grew up, I was born in 1949. So I'm 74 in a few weeks. And I feel inside that I'm about 24. I'm as passionate about all the things I talk about and write about as ever. And my values were shaped by my father and mother. Mum came from the border of Queensland and New South Wales, a little town called Wallangarra. So they were both country folk and they worked hard. And in those days, I remember Mum saying that it was a luxury when Dad could bring a bottle of beer home on a Friday night after work to have a celebration. And that stuck with me, that and other things she told me. And some of my earliest memories of Dad building our fibro house in bushland in suburban Sydney, and sawing the fibro, no doubt inhaling lots of fibrous material, which you shouldn't have. And so everything I grew up with, it was really the sweat of their brows, as it were, that made it possible, like my whole generation. Now, I could spend my days wandering around what was mostly bushland in that part of Sydney at the time with my friends in bare feet, and just as long as I was home by dark was all anybody cared about. And I think my childhood in the 50s and early 60s was the most idyllically happy childhood any human being could ever have. I was secure in a loving household. We weren't rich by any means. I know they struggled financially, but we, 3 kids, 3 boys, were never, ever short of something to eat. And I think my story there is the story of many, many baby boomers, people from my generation. Now, I've spent a bit of time describing that early childhood because it's been absolutely formative for me in shaping my attitudes. I am trying, in a sense, to recreate the safety and the security and the family stability of the 50s and 60s that I experienced, that all my friends experienced in the area. Now, I don't think it matters whether you were growing up in suburban Sydney or anywhere else in Australia or North Queensland. I think it was the similar lifting of the tide, lifting all the ships at that time. There was a huge growth in prosperity in this country. It was a struggle, but they were amazing fossil fuel driven years. We got rich because we had access to cheap energy. That's another story for another day. Now, where did my interest in criminology and crime and social problems come from? It came from my parents. My first 2 degrees at the University of Sydney were in mathematics, quantum physics, and my master's degree, which I published in a journal, was on the, it was hyperdimensional non-Euclidean geometries and their application to the design of experiments. Now, I decided at the ripe old age of 22 that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life doing that sort of pure mathematics. Thank you very much. Even though I loved it and I solved a lot of problems, it wasn't what I wanted. And I discovered people who were trying to use the science that I'd learned, the scientific method, to have a better understanding through the collection of statistics and the analysis, as you said in the introduction, the analysis of problems, so that you can figure out what to do about some of the intractable social problems like crime and homelessness and social disadvantage. And I've spent most of my career trying to work with people in communities to make life better. And I've tried to use my research to do that. And I've particularly focused in the last 30 years or so on the positive development of children and young people in socially disadvantaged communities. I got the job up at Griffith in 1992. So I've been up here now for 31 years. And it's been an amazing experience. Griffith has been a rapidly growing university in that time. It now straddles the Gold Coast and Brisbane. And in fact, the biggest campus is now on the Gold Coast. You were talking about James Cook University before, Bill, and how it is in both Townsville and Cairns, but Townsville tells Cairns what to do. Well, it's like that for us in Brisbane here. It's the Gold Coast that cracks the whip now, because they've got the numbers. So I'm very familiar with universities spread across many locations, but I took the opportunity. Well, how did I get into criminology? It was because I met an amazing man. None of your viewers or listeners will have heard of him, Tony Vincent. He was a working class lad whom I met at about the age of 22, who was setting up a new research bureau within the New South Wales government called the Bureau of Crime Statistics and Research. And the idea was to collect statistics, official stats on crime, and to do research on problems that the government wanted solved. And that's what I did for 5 years with him. And he gave me a vision, particularly for geographical disadvantage. I don't have it on my wall behind me, because I've now got a map of Australia showing all the Aboriginal language groups across Australia, hundreds of them. But I have another diagram that shows in those days, the huge concentration of crime and imprisonment and homelessness and welfare dependency in the inner city of Sydney and the western suburbs, compared with the affluent and leafy North Shore or the eastern suburbs. And that's when I learned that inequality is all pervasive, and poverty affects every aspect of people's lives. And I've been very active in the press and on radio and television in the last few weeks talking about youth crime. I'm getting emails from people now telling me about their life in public housing in Queensland, or the battles they've faced. It's going to become quite a job for me to respond to all these letters and emails. I actually got a letter from a 99-year-old gentleman in an aged care home who espousing his theories on youth crime. So I do try and respond to all of those emails and letters. So if you're listening tonight, you haven't got a reply yet you will get one. But it was the influence of this man, Tony Benson, that showed me that I could use my skills in maths and stats and in research to get a better understanding of the concentration of disadvantage, and why did the majority of people in prison come from about 6 or 8 regions. Wasn't equally spread across the community. And that's very much true in Queensland. The most affluent parts of Queensland are on the coast in central Queensland and in Brisbane, in parts of Brisbane. The most socially disadvantaged in terms of income and access to services and everything else, including youth crime, tends to be in regional areas. Now, it's obviously not uniform, but it's a fundamental injustice that where you live has a huge effect on your life expectancy, on your risks of being a victim of crime. For kids growing up, they don't get the opportunities that other kids get. So that's been the area that I've been struggling with. So even before I got involved in crime research, I've had this vision of a more equitable society, which in many ways was what I experienced in the 1950s and 60s, where I think we did have a more equitable society post-war, where most people had very little, but they helped each other when people were in trouble, and so we had cohesive communities. And as I said before, kids on the whole did not go without food, except if you lived in some of these very deprived areas.
But one of the things of those days, because actually I'll tell you after the show, but my life mirrors yours pretty well, even down to the Air Force and Army and that.
Yeah, well, that's right, and that is the story of our generation.
And the thing is, you're talking about people helping out others when in hard times or problems, but it was also not just that. There were people just helped out each other in normal day-to-day life. In regards to you were saying your father built a fibro house in out sticks of Sydney. Well, my father did exactly the same. And what it was, I think he had a mate who was a bit handy with as a chippy, and so was he. And then we had a friend who was a plumber and that. And our first house was a fibro house. I think there was a main bedroom, a lounge, a kitchen area, a small bedroom, and then out the back there was a sort of long bungalow sort of thing that you could divide up. Yeah. And that was great. Like most people would be happy with that sort of having that sort of accommodation. And I remember that the whole thing only cost £900, right? And because I remember that because Dad was working it out with all his mates, paying, because he actually paid some of them for some help because they had to get materials and stuff like that. So that was the thing. It was in all everyday life, people were engaged with each other. Today, you don't even talk to your neighbours hardly because they're just running around and doing all the different things. Yeah,
that's true. And we've all got busier, and the working life has got harder. It's got less secure for most people, that's for sure. although Dad lost his job in 1949 with the coal strike. And that's when he joined the Public Works Department. And he was able to maintain his career there until he retired. Now, you mentioned something I was going to say, and I've now forgotten it. Doesn't matter. Anyway, I'll just say briefly before getting on to the subject of the discussion tonight. My first task when I moved to Macquarie University in the mid-70s, I got very interested in the problem of drinking and driving. I was nearly killed one night in Sydney with a bloke who was all over the road, and he came up and he smashed into a pole just behind me, and the car almost turned upside down. And he got out of the car bleeding, and he was as blind drunk as anybody could be, and still walk. And he pleaded with me not to call the police. Now, you know, he just about wiped me out, and I did call the police, and an off-duty policeman came almost straight away anyway by accident. And so I don't know what happened to him. I hope he went to jail. But it made me aware of the huge problem we had in Australia in the late 1970s, early 1980s with alcohol. Per capita alcohol consumption in Australia peaked in the late 1970s, believe it or not. And if you remember those days, drinking and driving was almost normal, particularly amongst my generation. So I looked at the research on this, and I came up with the idea of mass random breath testing. So the kind of RBT that we're all familiar with today is basically what I designed back in the early 80s as a young lecturer in behavioural sciences at Macquarie University. And I persuaded the chair of the Stay Safe Committee in Sydney, who was a backbench Labor politician at the time, to have a go at this new approach, not to arrest people. I didn't want to see people go to jail. I didn't want to see lots of arrests. I wanted to see safer roads. I wanted to see fewer accidents. So they took a risk and they introduced mass random breath testing, pretty much as I had recommended it back in December 1982. And the accident statistics and the hospital statistics, if you plot them as a graph on a daily basis over time, pre and post RBT, it was absolutely spectacular. The statistics fell off a cliff. There was something like a 40% reduction in admissions to emergency for alcohol-related accidents overnight. The doctors were saying this is an amazing experience. And the amazing thing is that the success of RBT has now been maintained for, 40 years across all states and territories of Australia, because I spent about 2 years going around Australia persuading assistant commissioners of police who were in charge of traffic to adopt this idea. And of course, the success in New South Wales quickly spread to other states. So that was my first excursion into what's now called prevention science, the science of prevention. And my model of unpredictable mass random breath testing, where it was as important to see the police doing what they did, right, even if you weren't yourself pulled over, that whole model was based on my reading about and study of the theory of deterrence. We all talk about deterring crime. Well, the way to do that is to put the fear of God into people, that if they commit this particular offence, namely drive after drinking, then they've got a high chance of getting caught or noticed by the police, and they can't do anything about it because it's random. Because I heard so many stories from drunk drivers who said, oh, yeah, look, I think there should be more policing of it, but I'm a better driver when I'm drunk than when I'm drunk. Have you ever heard anybody say that?
Yes, I have. I've heard that as an excuse.
The thing about random breath testing is it's unpredictable, and it's in your face. You see it frequently. There's publicity, of course, supporting this as well. And so there's nothing you can do by your cleverness to reduce your chances of being pulled over and tested. And the effect is amazing, but I wrote a book on this called Policing and Punishing the Drinking Driver, if anybody's interested in having a look. What I was able to show was that even beyond the direct deterrent impact of the new law was the fact that people now had a face-saving excuse not to drink when they were with their mates at the pub. but if they were driving, became socially acceptable very quickly to say, no, I'll just have one, or I'll just have a shandy or something because I've got to go home and I'm driving. And so the idea of the designated driver developed. Of course, this is also happened in other countries.
And it was a good excuse to get home to your wife and family where you should be anyway.
And the research I did, which was through some surveys that basically the survey company donated because they could see the value of this research. I mean, I had a grant, but I didn't have enough money to pay for the full cost of the hundreds and hundreds of people who were surveyed, but it showed that it really did have an impact, and it changed our way of life forever. And that made me, and the important thing is that this affected everybody, it benefited everybody. And it turned out, if you looked at the blood alcohol curve, that is the distribution of blood alcohol levels amongst the drivers pulled over, we saw a bigger reduction amongst the heavier drinkers. The heaviest drinkers changed their behaviour most. You see, everyone had criticised me when I was proposing this random model, saying you'll never deter the alcoholic who's just going to drink regardless. You know, nothing will affect that sort of person. Well, that's not true. They may be addicted to alcohol, but they're not necessarily addicted to driving. So they did modify their behaviour, and we saw a big drop in accidents amongst the extremely high blood alcohol range. So this is a model of general prevention, population level prevention, that we could achieve with youth crime. If we got organised as a state and as a country to do this, it wouldn't be random breath testing that you'd use. What you would do is implement across whole communities a whole range of evidence-based interventions through local community partnerships. Okay, we've got to put the control back into local communities, and we've got to establish partnerships with people, experts who actually do know about the things that work in terms of turning the lives of these kids around. Of course, not every good idea is effective. Do you want me to stop talking for a while, Bill, or
No. I'll jump in.
Believe me, I could go on like this for hours, so, because you're on my favourite subject now. So I'll tell you give you an example of a really good idea that spectacularly backfired. You may have heard of scared straight. This is where you get kids who are particularly at-risk kids, kids who are starting to get into trouble with the police. You get them together and you take them to the local prison, and you get your toughest prisoner who's there for 30 years for murder or something, and he tries to convince the kids, look, it's not smart to end up like me for decades or years and years in a prison. It's not a good life. Some of these interventions were very well done. So the idea was to scare kids straight so that they would be deterred from a life of crime. It had the opposite effect. It actually made a life of crime sound attractive and dangerous and interesting. And all the evaluations show that the kids who are exposed to scared straight rather than a comparison group actually started to commit crime at a higher.
I suppose that when you come from a household where dad's just got a stayed job and mum's just got a stayed job and everything's sort of regimented, it does seem a bit boring or whatever. I'm going to do the same thing. Whereas, like you say, go and see a criminal, it's a different element sort of, and like you say, it could easily go wrong, and obviously did.
It did go wrong, and it always goes wrong. That's the interesting thing. Every time it's been tried and evaluated, you get the same result. It increases the crime rate by about 30% amongst those kids. Now, another good example of a good idea that backfired, and wait for this, it's boot camps. Now, you're a military man, Bill. Military discipline has value. Definitely, you get up, you get physically fit, you race around, you march around or run around the parade ground with a heavy pack. I don't know, what do you do? You could tell us in graphic detail, no doubt. 100 push-ups.
But the thing is, you wanted to be there. That's the whole point. You join the Army or Air Force because you go to serve your country. So you're there, and yes, you go through that basic training, and it can be, for some, it can be fairly brutal. I followed my father. I went into the Air Force, and they were always known as the powder puffs anyway. So life going into the Air Force wasn't that dramatic. You still did the basics, but it was nothing to be compared to go and do the basics in the army. You know, it's, I don't know if I would have survived that. So it's horses for courses, but the thing is, people joined up willingly. And that's one of the things I get a bit aggro about in regards to people saying, well, we should put them we should have national service and people would put these. Well, people in the Army and Navy really don't want the dregs of society. They want people who want to be there, who share their values, and they can depend on when their life's in danger. And that's not going to come from someone pushed in there, disgruntled, who doesn't want to be there.
No, well, turns out it's similar with boot camps. The idea of boot camps is that you do introduce structure and discipline into the lives of these young people. And it is, the early boot camps were very much focused on the physical side of things, you know, the discipline and the exercise and doing what you were told and shutting up, that sort of thing. Now, again, the evaluations all showed that it backfired and it increased the crime rate. And the reason is, it didn't actually deal with any of the causes of the offending that these young people were engaged in. I mean, kids who get involved in youth crime, particularly if they become the serious repeat offenders that you're most concerned with in the north of Australia, in Cairns and Townsville in particular, and Mount Isa and other regional areas there, the serious repeat offender comes from 100% almost, and I use this word advisedly, are damaged. They've had to battle multiple adversities in their life right from the time before they were born. There was a study done in the Banksia Hill Detention Centre in Perth about 4 years ago by the Institute for Child Health Research in Perth, and they tested 99 kids in the detention centre, many of whom were Indigenous, of course, being WA, and 37% of the 99 had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, in some cases very severely. Now, what FASD does, and this is acquired from your mum who drinks during pregnancy, so it's brain damage. And it's a spectrum because it varies in its severity. In the most extreme cases, you can do a brain scan and you can actually see just from photographs comparing with a normal brain that the brains of these extreme FASD kids are shrunk, particularly the frontal part of the brain, with the prefrontal lobe, which has to do with emotion regulation, self-control, concentration, and all the things that we need in the army or in a job, whether
or school.
Or school, exactly. So how are these kids going to survive in school? Now, FASD as a risk for kids has really only come to the fore in about the last 10 years. There was an Aboriginal colleague of mine here in Brisbane, Dr. Jan Homel, who had a background as a community nurse, did a PhD on, an amazing woman, and she died about 18 months ago. But she was the first person in Australia to really recognise, because she did so much work with Aboriginal kids, she was the first to call the alarm on this, and it's grown and grown and grown so that it's just mainstream now. We realise this is a huge issue now, and I will guarantee that many of the kids that we're seeing on television, nightly news, with baseball bats and machetes going around breaking into shops, into houses, and occasionally killing people, a good percentage of these kids would be damaged in this way. They would have no capacity to control. If they get an idea in their head, they'll just do it. They're people you don't want to annoy because they'll lash out in anger. Now, we've discovered also just recently that there are good clinical interventions. If you do one-to-one work with these kids, you can actually modify their behaviour. You can teach them to understand their emotions and to control them, and to learn to behave in a way which is civil and pro-social, not antisocial. And you can even start teaching them some basic skills, which will eventually get them a job. They're not a lost cause in most cases. So we can turn them around, but it's very expensive. It takes a lot of effort, one-on-one, with highly skilled therapists who can turn them around, and it takes time. Now, I've given that as an extreme example, but 90% of the kids in that Banksia Hill study in the detention centre had at least one serious neurodevelopmental disorder. That means that the physical health, mental health, they're all disabled, essentially, in their capacity to learn and to function in normal society. This is what youth detention does. It's a vacuum cleaner for the most disadvantaged and the most damaged children in our society. That's essentially what it is. And that may not be so terrible if we actually did a lot of intensive therapy with these kids to turn their lives around and to make the community safer, just by the way. I mean, eventually these kids are going to get out again, unless you want to lock people up for the term of their natural life.
But that detention system where there's, maybe 100 youths in detention, it's not the environment that you can do that one-on-one, because what happens, the peer group pressure is you don't want to be seen as sort of improving or something or modifying your behaviour, because the group will turn against you, or you won't be with the group. So it needs, like you say, it needs to be done outside that sort of where bulk numbers are.
That is, you're right, and it's blindingly obvious, isn't it, that detention is the worst possible environment for therapy, for treatment that's going to actually turn these kids' lives around. And I've got access to a lot of the American research. There's a report that I could, if people want to email me after this, I can send you a copy, a PDF, of a recently published US report, and it's called Why Youth Incarceration Fails. One of the reasons it fails as a deterrent and as a way of reducing crime is that the experience of detention itself actually slows down the normal rate of maturation in kids. Kids have to learn the psychosocial skills of the kind that I described a minute ago, the ability to control their emotions, to learn to interact socially in a way that means that they're going to have friends and not alienate everybody, so that they don't try and dominate, hit and grab rather than negotiate, all these sorts of skills. These kids typically lack those skills, and the detention environment, the prison environment, actually slows down any improvement that you could otherwise bring about. You get much better results, as you just said, Bill, when they're outside in the community. And now many of these very serious offenders are going to need 24/7 supervision. If they're not in a detention centre, they're going to need to be in a small group therapeutic environment, a residential environment where they are not able to leave. So that it won't be voluntary. This will be a court order for these serious offenders. But we know from research in the US and in England and elsewhere in Australia that works. I mean, there was a wonderful evaluation published of the residential drug treatment program for youth offenders that's run by the Ted Knopf's Foundation. It's actually run by one of Ted Knopf's grandsons, Matt Knopf's, who rang me today because I mentioned his name on television, ABC TV News last night, and he wanted to thank me. But the importance of his program is that it's just been evaluated, and they did a 5-year follow-up, and they showed substantial reductions in criminal offending amongst the kids who were serious offenders, who were drug and alcohol dependent, who'd been right through the residential program. They did a 5-year follow-up with both self-reports of offending as well as official crime data. And they showed something like a 30 or 40% reduction in offending. Amazing results. And that has now been introduced into Queensland for youth offenders. So that's an example of a very positive evidence-based intervention that now has been shown to be extremely effective.
I think the issue now with the public is that this problem has got so large so quickly in the last couple of years. Like, yes, it was around. I've been in Cairns for nearly 10 years, 12 years. Yes, it's been around, but it never elevated up to this level, to really getting up to a car a day, or, it was less than a car a day, but then we've got up to 3 cars a day. So as Townsville, you're talking about, over years, we've hit 1,200 cars. And then the elevation from not just joyriding in, but basically being a threat to other people on the road, driving careless. Well, they don't know how to drive anyway. Yeah. And then the other thing, then last year they got into this habit of torching the vehicles. So, so you can have a situation where a recidivist offender, racks up three car thefts in a couple of weeks. Well, that's $100,000 to $200,000 worth of property destroyed, and right. And what's really angered most people is no one's given a rat's about the victims over this time. I mean, the victims don't even get a look in regards to consideration. It's just, and that's probably where a lot of the angst comes from in regards to, well, we've got to spend more billions, more hundreds of billions of dollars on these kids, and yet the good side of society is the ones who are going to have to pay for it or go short of something or services.
Yep. Well, the sorts of interventions I'm describing are a lot cheaper than building more detention centres. It costs $750,000 to keep one child in a detention centre over a year, whereas the treatment programs I'm describing are just a 1/10 or less of that. So the cost-benefit equation is obvious. I understand about the sense of powerlessness and frustration of the victims. I really do. I really grieve with some of the victims, particularly those who have lost a loved one through that terrible event in Brisbane a few weeks ago, on Boxing Day, I think it was, when a young woman was knifed. Yeah, Emma, at North Lakes in Brisbane. It's horrifying. And this is a really serious problem, and serious problems demand a serious response. I have described what both sides of politics are engaging in at the moment as a pantomime. Now, making breach of bail a criminal offence, tightening up all of the laws, increasing the maximum penalties for car theft from 5 years to 7 years. Do you think, as a 14-year-old kid who's got this sorts of damage that I've described earlier, is out on the street at 1 a.m. with mates, looking for something to break into or to steal, it's going to be, going to think about what Mark Ryan, the police minister, has just said in Parliament about the maximum penalties. And it doesn't work. They don't think rationally at all. Most of these kids don't have a sense of the future at all for them. They've got no capacity, therefore, to make rational decisions about what's in their best interest, as well as not harming others. Now, one alternative to the court processing system, which is where these kids typically go through, is to use restorative justice approaches. And it turns out from all the research on this is where the victim and their family and friends and supporters meet face-to-face in a facilitated discussion or conference with the offender and their family or friends or peer group. And the facilitator ensures civil discussion. The victim explains the harm and the serious harm and damage and the trauma that the crime that young person has caused to them and their family and friends. The offender then, they work out together, the victim and the offender and all the others that are there, they work out a plan for this offender. What does the victim and their families think is an appropriate outcome for this young person? It turns out that even in very serious violent crimes where this has been used, this approach, and it is used in Queensland, not enough, but it is used, even in the most serious crimes, often the victims they will want some period of imprisonment, but in addition, they want community service. They want this young person to work on behalf of the community to repair some of the damage that they've done through their serious criminal offending. And the evaluations show, firstly, that everybody is much more satisfied with this process as a system of justice than the routine appearance in court with a judge and so on. Secondly, and even more important, it reduces the reoffending rate. It reduces recidivism, because some of these young people, not all, you've got to be a bit careful in who you choose for this program, some of them are capable of hearing and understanding for the first time the damage and the harm and the grief and the fear and trauma that their actions have caused to the victim. Now
Okay.
that's restorative justice, and it works, and it's just better than
A key element of that would have to be the offender's family and backup system.
That's
But
right.
we're talking about here where
Yeah.
these kids, from the age of 7 or 8 are out on the street to
That's right.
all
That's
bloody hours. So the support network of a family, or even a decent peer group or extended family, just is not there. I mean,
No.
whether you'd probably need to go back and have a look at each of these families, individuals, to come up with some sort of statistics in regards to what's happening in the homes. Is anyone working in the home? Is their mum and dad there? Are all the siblings from the same father? What's the ins and outs of the family? Who's coming and going in that household and that? Because it is something that needs to be looked at, because that's where the core of the problem is, in the household.
That's right. Well, some of these children don't have a household. They are in the care of the Child Safety Department. In other words, the Director General of the Department of Youth Justice and Child Safety is their legal guardian. Now, that would be probably, I would estimate, varies from over time, but it's about 1/3 of all the kids, and probably a higher percentage of those on the street. They actually don't have a home to go home to.
Do you think we could the program that you'd like to do, it's going to cost money, but do you think there's a lot of money already going out there, out into NGOs and other groups and that?
Correct.
That is badly spent, absolutely terrible. I know for a fact in Cairns, I think there's 22 different groups. None of them operate after 5 o'clock at night. None operate on the weekend. They're basically useless, but they get big handouts, and don't worry, their people get paid pretty well. That money would be better spent just ditching all those things and concentrating on a program, and it has to be government run, and the facilities would have to be built.
Well, yeah, there is what's called the co-responder, excuse me, the co-responder model. We have youth workers from either youth justice or, you have youth justice workers on the street after hours, in fact, all night if necessary. Obviously, it's got to be shift work. And they work in partnership with the police. And so kids who are on the street who haven't necessarily committed a crime can be invited to a safe place for the night by the organisation. In Brisbane, it's the Youth Advocacy Centre that is a partner in this co-responder approach, and they have facilities to look after a certain number of kids night by night. Now, that's part of the solution, that what you need to do is get the kids off the street into supervised and safe care. If they've not actually committed an offence, that's got to be voluntary, but it's not too difficult to persuade them that. And you've got a real opportunity. Now, I talked about deterrence earlier on in this discussion this evening. Some of these kids, if you sit down with the youth worker and the police actually communicate with them rather than chasing them, as you were saying earlier, it turns out that most of them, even those with developmental disorders, understand that the life they're living now is leading nowhere. In fact, it's going to lead to a life of grief for them. Most of them, when you get them away from their mates, actually want what everybody else wants. They want to get a school qualification, they want to get a job, they want to be ordinary people, citizens. And that's our goal. It should be our goal, to create citizens, not criminals. And so this...
But one, just on that factor, but because they're running around with a peer group, and they might individually want to achieve some of these things, the interaction with their peer group,
got to break that group up.
doesn't would a good situation would be instead of thinking about, like with detention centres, there's just one in one place that takes 100. Do you think what the programs you're talking about would be better if we had, say, 10 positions in Cairns, 10 positions in Townsville, 10 positions, a couple of positions in Mareeba, 5 in Bowen, couple here, and sort of and that way they're more likely to interact with a smaller community and also have that break away from a lot of their peer pressure.
You've just described some of the key elements of the model of therapeutic care that we're actually advocating.
Oh, I'm smarter than I thought.
No, it's not smart. It's sorry, I shouldn't use the B word in public, but you know, it's just obvious. This is the way to go. You yourself made the point early on that detention, you know, barbed wire outside and deprivation of liberty, it's not the best environment in a detention centre with 100 other kids. I think there are 225 kids at the moment in detention in Queensland across 3 centres. So, you know, the sorts of numbers we're talking about are about right. But we really want these small group safe environments, therapeutic environments for about 6 or 8 kids. It depends how serious, how severe the problems are, what the numbers would be. And a lot of this detail has to be worked out. This model works. It's been pioneered in all places, Spain. There's a terrific, this is what they've done in Spain over the last few years, getting kids off the street, because this is a universal problem. This is not just North Queensland or regional Queensland that has this problem. In fact, the model of focused deterrence that I was describing, where the youth worker and the police sit down and talk with these kids one-on-one, not with the whole group of them, typically. This worked 25 years ago in Boston when there were gangs of kids roaming the streets and killing each other. They were engaged in warfare, turf warfare, with guns. This is being America. And this approach, which is called focused deterrence, which involved probation officers, youth workers, police and others, through respectful communication with these kids, it actually turned out that none of them wanted to get shot and die. They actually wanted a better life. So what you do, it's carrots and sticks. You say, if you keep doing what you're doing, we're going to hammer you so hard, you won't know where you are. But you will also at the same time open the door to every opportunity to get an education, get the skills. We'll deal with your drug problem. We'll work with you. We'll work with whoever exists in your family or friends to to make sure you get the support you need, or you create that support if they don't have anybody. And it worked. And actually, I could show you. I could send your listeners a refereed scientific paper that shows that focused deterrence it reduces the crime rate by 30 to 40% amongst this really hardcore group. You see, what I'm describing, and I can't do it properly in a very short period, I'm describing what sound like crazy ideas, but actually they work, and they work because they deal with genuine human psychology, and they deal with that in a genuine way. And if it comes to deterrence, you've got to offer an alternative that's very positive to entice these young people to get out of this game that they're playing, this deadly game with the police and with householders.
Well, the thing is, in regional Australia, we have a lot of townships and that have an issue with shrinking populations and things like that, you know, with schools. And I can see where, rather than spend $500 million on a new detention centre, well, let's have a targeted program. We'll go and we'll allocate 10 million. That's divided up by $10 million. That's 50 places. So we'll make a subject of Richmond, Hewington, what else is out there? Julia Creek, Concurry, and say, well, we'll allocate $10 million, and what we'll try to do is, what we'll do with that, we will get a doctor in that town, right? Then we will get a specialist psychologist or whatever's needed for your program, and then we may have a couple of carers who look after a household, and we put, say, a maximum of 3 to 5 disadvantaged children into these things. And I don't know, you might need some other assistance while there, and say, well, to me, $10 million, run a five-year program, that would probably cover it, and you'll get an idea of it's going to work. But the other thing that happens, that you're now in a smaller community where the community can have a good impact, because Correct. The community has its fairs, it has its horse riding, especially out in the rural area, and people can, integrate into those sort of what the general community does, but the community can have a positive program to help and assist with that program, if you know what I mean. And it gives wealth to that town too.
I applaud you. That's exactly what needs to happen. We've absolutely got to put control and responsibility into the hands of local people, and it's got to be resourced, because, as you say, they have a shrinking population. I was describing some of these ideas to the Country Women's Association executive just before Christmas, and they made exactly the same point. Some of their little towns they can't even get a GP at all into the, how are they going to get these other specialized youth workers and psychologists and so on? Well, one solution is to have a flying squad. Now that's not as good, but you could have a regional set of organizations and skilled people to provide these services, rotating around towns. I don't know how that would work, but I take your point that you can't have everything in very small localities, at least not for long enough to make a sustained difference. You could probably do it for a short period. But the principle is absolutely correct. We've got to, the detail has to be worked out. How do you make it sustainable? Some of it might have to be online, although I don't think that'll really work with these kids. So no, forget I said that. But there are terrific things that we know we can do. We're a clever country. We're a wealthy country, despite the economic pressures that everyone's feeling at the moment. We do amazing things in communities. We lead the world in volunteering and in community initiatives. We really are an amazing country. We don't like to boast about it, but the
more the government interferes, the more it gets mucked up.
Well, yeah, that's right. And in fact, one of my big criticisms of the Queensland government approach, and this is going back forever, not just the current government, it's so top down from George Street or William Street in Brisbane. We've got to get communities involved. Now, I have been promoting an approach that's been pioneered in Australia by a colleague of mine from down south, John Tombrou. He's from Geelong in regional Victoria. He has been implementing what's called communities that care as a way of involving local communities, mobilising communities to form a local coalition of organisations and stakeholders, people who are really passionate about positive outcomes for their kids and young people. And then those community partnerships run a survey through the local schools for the young people themselves to tell us what the issues are in their lives. That's a quantitative survey. It produces a validated profile of the needs of children in that local community. And that might vary quite markedly from even 10 miles down the road. Communities vary a lot in their specific mix of needs for young people. Now, based on that measured need, the local partnership then identifies interventions that match the priority needs as measured, as explained to the coalition through that survey. If we had time, I could explain how we've done an even more clever thing, being Queenslanders. We have invented a computer game for primary age children, which we call Rumble's Quest, which is a valid and reliable scientific instrument that produces data on the social and emotional well-being of these kids. They tell us about their lives, about how their relationship at school, at home, their friends, all aspects of their life through a conversation with a fictitious character called Rumble. And they save a village from destruction through earthquake as part of their adventure and have this conversation in this game. And it produces data that we've now run this with about 40,000 kids throughout Australia, about more than half of those in Queensland. And you get a very good idea of what the issues are in that particular community or in that school. So I just mention that because there are clever ways, interesting ways you can engage children to tell you honestly about the things that worry them and the things that they're happy about in their lives. I didn't invent this personally. It was by a colleague of mine, so I can say it's the best thing ever invented. In fact, it's unique internationally. Nobody else has achieved what we've achieved, and it's about to be published in the US. We can do things in Australia that other people haven't thought of. We do it well. I believe in putting power back into local communities, and that communities will make mistakes. So you need to, scared straight looks like a good idea on the face of it. There are things that sound like a good idea, taking a bunch of young thugs together out to do abseiling in the wilderness experience. You could have two results. You could either have a really good maturation experience for those kids, or they could teach each other new crimes and new skills, new social skills.
They have become a cat burglar.
And that in fact has happened with some of those wilderness or camping programs.
But one of the key things has to be looking at the domestic situation in a lot of these households, and we really have to address that, because I don't care. I can walk around Cairns and I can tell you whether in 5 years I can point to kids, they're going to be on the streets doing this, because you can see what their makeup and their household looks like.
You're absolutely right. And
there's no males in their life. No. There is no. You've got a household. All those things need to be sort of in the mix in regards to at least the discussion how we're going to address it.
Absolutely, and it turns out that you're right. You're absolutely right. Mentoring from a male figure, particularly for boys, who is a credible role model, is one of the most effective ways of teaching kids to pro-social values and not carrying knives and all that sort of stuff. So you've got to support families and the school as well if they're still engaged with school, and that's so. The younger you start this approach, the better. You've already put your finger on it again, Bill. You've been right about 10 times tonight, just because you're using your common sense. Never too early and never too late, but the earlier the better, because it's much easier to work with 4 and 5 year olds and 6 year olds in the primary school age, and with their families if the families are functional enough, and the schools and the community elders and others that are important in the lives of these kids. If you use that wraparound holistic approach and use evidence-based strategies to deal with the issues that are identified in the lives of those kids, particularly conduct problems. We've done a lot of this work in a disadvantaged community in Brisbane, and I haven't got time. I haven't even mentioned all of that work tonight. But I know what I'm talking about. There were 4-year-olds that were in our initial preschool intervention who had already failed all the behaviour management programs that the education department could make available. These kids almost certainly are now in the youth justice or in the adult criminal justice system. You're right, and it turns out teachers are very good at rating the behaviour of the kids in their class. And teacher-rated classroom behaviour turns out to be one of the best possible predictors of the future behaviour of these kids. We have shown through our own work, by enriching the preschool environment with what were a whole set of communication skills, we taught these 4-year-olds the teachers that we brought in taught these kids how to understand when an adult was talking to them and asking a question, and that needed a response, and then they learned the skills of talking with their peers at age 4 and not hitting if they wanted something, but rather talking. That we're just finishing an evaluation of that over a 15-year period. And the really good news is we can say that had a substantial effect on the risk of on the chances of those kids ending up in the youth justice system. And what was done at age 4, the teachers throughout primary school rated the behaviour of all of these kids, 600 or so in the cohort. And we can show that the early intervention at ages 4 and 5, through that communication and the family support that also went on with those families, it was translated into better behaviour in the classroom. So the teachers were very happy, and it translated into a less chance of ending up in the youth justice system for serious youth offending. And that, to me, is a good news story. It's consistent with hundreds of studies now from around Australia and around the world that early intervention and prevention works. And I get passionate about this, Bill, and I know you want to say something, and we've got to wrap up. But I just want to leave your listeners, the participants tonight, with hope. There are so many good things we can do. They're not hard. They're 100th of the cost of all the prisons and detention centres we're building. Let us hold the politicians to account, and I don't care whether they're National Party, Liberal, Green, Katter, Labor, they're all the same. They're all as bad as each other. We've got to hold them to account. As the Courier Mail in their headline was actually quite rightly saying, let's build the KPIs. Let's see the transparent evidence that what they're doing works. And the only way they're going to get those results is if they stop the top-down command and control approach, thinking they can do it all within the public service, and getting onto the streets and into the communities and working with communities, fostering the development of these partnerships, and equipping and resourcing and supporting those local groups to do absolutely the best they can with their own kids in their own communities. And if we do that in a wholehearted way across the state, we'll transform the lives of so many families, so many children, and it will create a better and more safe society for Queenslanders in about just a few years' time. It won't take long.
Well, just going away from the disadvantaged families, also just the normal families and that, do you think one of the problems we have in our society is that parents have passed too much parenting on to teachers over the last 10, 20 years? Because when I was a kid, our parents had a partnership with the teachers, right? And actually, they had a partnership with the whole neighbourhood. If I did something wrong, or me and my mates got up, if it got back to Dad through a friend or something, you'd cop it. If you'd been in trouble at school and it got back home, you got another serve. So that all intermixed sort of thing. Parents went down and engaged with the teachers. But these days, sometimes parents go down and want to fight the teachers or punch them up. Do you think there's been too much parenting responsibility or something passed down to the teachers, not only just in disadvantage, but just normal families as well?
Yeah, look, what you're describing is a real problem. The schools are critical. Teachers can be great partners. Most of them are keen to do that, not all. I totally agree with what you're saying. And what we did in that work I described with the preschoolers was actually all done with the full cooperation of the schools in the area. And indeed, it all happened inside the schools, as well as supporting the families through emergency relief and all the other things that went on out in the community.
But besides the KPIs, I'd like to see a breakdown of the money that they spent. On detention centres, the cost of warders, all the other infrastructure that's got to go with it. Then the money that goes down to the NGOs that's supposed to be helping the state wards, and then the money that's put into the carers. I just love that to be broken down, and then with a grand total, and say, right, this ain't working. Here's this, hundreds of millions of dollars. Let's do something better with it.
Yeah, and the name for what you've just said is justice reinvestment. Take the money out of bricks and mortar and prisons and detention centres and put it into communities and into things that work. That's called justice reinvestment. So there you are. You've invented that tonight as well. Have a look.
We should have discussions on other things. We might come up with a lot of different ideas.
Bill, you are a thoughtful, mature Australian male of approximately my age, perhaps younger. You are typical of the resources that exist, the human resources that are out there. There are hundreds of bills out there. I have met people in Townsville and in other parts of regional Queensland who are falling over themselves to get involved in the community and to try and work on some of these issues. We may not always agree with those people on absolutely everything they want to do, but you've got to give people freedom to try out different approaches and that they believe suit the local situation. The more you can be guided by the evidence on what works, the better. Mentoring is great, but you've got to get it right. You've got to do the residential drug treatment for those kids that need it. Drug substance abuse prevention is important. There's a whole range of things. There's a huge amount of experience in all of the communities. Don't have to reinvent the wheel. And look, to give them their due, the Youth Justice Department do their absolute best with the kids that they have for long enough to try and implement some of these very good evidence-based strategies. And they do get some success with that. We forget that there are hard-working people who are, day in, day out working with some of the most difficult kids in this community, and they don't get much thanks for what they do.
Well, I suppose it makes it so much harder when the kids don't have that supportive family, that supportive network, and they're just there on their own devices.
And you can see why I'm so passionate about doing our best as a community to recreate those ideal conditions that I remember as a child. Now, I may be romanticizing it, but it doesn't matter. It's still a good thing to do that.
But like you say, even at that time, we know for our parents it was still tough. I mean,
it was.
But everyone enjoyed the same amount of difficulty, but they all chipped in and sort of helped, and that's probably why it worked so well.
Yeah, and of course there were serious social problems back then. We can't overlook that. But I think we have lost some things in Australia with our pursuit of wealth. My fibro house that I grew up in doesn't exist anymore. It's replaced by an enormous mansion, which takes up almost the whole block.
Well, the other thing that was different, our parents did it on one wage.
Yeah, that's right.
That was common,
Yeah.
But I mean, I think probably in the 80s when we had dinks, double income, no kids sort of thing, then all the marketeers worked out how much they could extract. And then that made a lot of people exchange, well, I can't live on a single wage, I've got to get my wife to go and work. And that probably adds to a lot of the change in the social adhesion that we had back in the 50s and 60s.
I think that's right. Anyway, Bill, are we going to draw this to a close now?
Yes, we'll just wind up now. If you'd just like to finish off with any remarks of that as we go forward.
I just want to repeat what I said a moment ago. I'm a pathological optimist about Australia and about this particular problem. I know we can turn this around, but it's going to take, we've got to get organised to do it. We've got to have the will to do it. I think we've just about turned a corner in Queensland now. We're holding the government to account, at least to some extent. I think I've met with a lot of these politicians on both sides, and the ones we've been talking to, I think they're all ashamed of what's happened, to be quite honest, with the recent law changes. Not all of them, but some of them. I think we now have an opportunity to really push the early intervention and prevention and therapeutic treatment approach. What you said at the beginning, get them out of detention, get them into the community, into small settings, which, if necessary, are supervised 24/7 for the most serious offenders. Let's put our heart and soul into this as a state for the next 10, 15 years and keep evaluating as we go. So we need that transparency that you mentioned. We need the rigorous evaluations. I don't disbelieve what goes on, from George Street, but they don't ever share all of the evidence with us. We can't see the evidence on what the intensive wraparound services at the moment are achieving for these most dangerous young people. I believe they're doing good things. I'm hoping a report will come out. We need more transparency. We need above all to devolve responsibility and resources back to communities so that we can have partnerships between communities and university academics who know about how to do these sorts of things, as well as the NGOs and the other people out in the regions who have expertise, and local lived knowledge is important as well. All of that should be in the mix, and we need to be underpinned by respectful relationships. We're not always going to agree, but we can respect the views of others, and we can move together on the basis of good data and good evidence and do things which are going to be win-win-win for our communities, for the kids, and even for those very, very dysfunctional families that have been going to prison for the last 4 generations. We can still make a better life for those families as well.
Well, I'd like to thank you for your time tonight. It's very much appreciated. And I'm sure you're going to get bombarded with other people in regards to finding out information from you and your expertise. But if you could just stay on the line for a few minutes, I'll just talk off air and introduce next week's show. If you enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, or subscribe to our Facebook page and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Next week, I'll be interviewing Bill Cummings, economist for Cairns. And actually, some people have described him as a living treasure for what he doesn't know about Cairns in regards to its economic development from the past through to what it needs in the future. No one else does. So please join me again next week. Thank you.